So, welcome everyone. I'm really glad you're joining us from all these parts of the world for yet another session of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Panel discussions, of course. It's one of our longest standing events. I think it exists almost as long as Diversify and HerSpace. So I usually get quite emotional and happy when another event is about to start. The topic for today, as you know, is decolonizing feminism and gender equality. And of course, it's inspired by and echoes International Women's Day. We celebrated on the 8th of March. With this conversation, we would like to lift this topic and amplify voices that are still marginalized in the fight and efforts for gender equality. Considering the brilliant panel we have today, I can't wait to start this conversation. But first, before we start, I will invite everyone to introduce themselves. I will start. And of course, we always describe ourselves for members of our audience who might be visually impaired. So my name is Eva. I'm the director at Diversify, and I will be the moderator for today. I have pale skin, light hair, a bit shorter under my ears, brown eyes, and I'm wearing like a green sweater, and I have a blurry white background. Thandi, can you continue?
Thank you. My name is Thandi. I am sitting here in Copenhagen. I also have a blurred screen because, you know, you never know when your kids arrive in the room that I try to escape to. I used to have really dark brown hair, but now it's really gray and oldish, but, you know, wisdom. I have light brown skin. I'm half Danish, half South African, or I'm wholly Danish and whole South African. I'm a consultant. I'm super happy to sit here with the four of you today.
Thank you, Thandi. Qivioq?
Thank you. My name is Qivioq Nivi Løvstrøm, and I am from New Greenland. And yes, I am an indigenous Inuk. And I have dark brown hair bordering black. And I have brownish, greenish eyes. They change depending on the weather and my mind, I guess. And I have pale skin. And I am wearing clothes made by a Greenlandic designer, and my earrings are made by a wonderful Greenlandic friend of mine. And they look kind of like a sunset or a sun up, depending on your point of view. And I have tattoos on my fingers. I'm saying this because my hands will pop up. I speak often with my hands, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. And of course, last but not least, our Chisom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chisom. I'm trying to describe myself now. I am a Black woman, brown skin. I'm wearing my hair in jumbo braids, so like large braids. I have some hair jewelry in gold color in my hair, and maybe you might see one that is pink. I'm wearing a sweater that has a maroon or crimson colored neck, and it's also white. Behind me, my background is also blurred. You might see the makings of a clock in the background. And yeah, my pronouns are she, her. So nice to be here I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's been a hard day, so I feel like this is the conversation that I need to have today. So thank you.
Okay, to that note, Chisom, let's jump right in with the first question. So this is a question for all three of you. Can you share what decolonization means to you in the context of feminism and gender equality? So Chisom, you can start.
Thank you. Well, it's a very interesting question, because what as Indigenous women often need is a system where we are already the most oppressed, not only being women, but also being Indigenous, and being fetishized or being treated as less than. And it's a system that is inherently colonial. And because of that, women who are white or who have grown up in the society that is the colonizing society can often feel like they easily can reach something that appears to be equity or equality with the men in that society. But it is very different for Indigenous women to reach that, because at the moment, many of us are still living in colonial ways, even though colonization is supposed to be over. And so the behaviorism in the corporate world, but also socially every day, is very different. And we also see it globally in the way that Western countries react to war in various countries. Some are treated with more importance, some are not even mentioned in the news. So we have a lot to uproot, but we also have to discuss whether or not something can truly be decolonized when it's inherently colonial.
Thank you. Chisom?
I actually wanted to see what Thandi thought. I think I'm like unraveling in my process of like what this means. So Thandi, if you'd like to share.
Yes, of course, take your time. I think decolonization for me is starting a LinkedIn Live with the way we did it, you know, like really inviting people into a space that's humanized and positive and warm and safe. And I also think decolonization in essence is about dismantling structures and mindsets, and also, like I just said, the way we do things. Because a colonized world is very much built on oppression and inequality, and decolonization kind of forces us to confront this legacy, and you know, it's intertwined with gender perspective, like all these different aspects of our lives. So decolonization for me is unlearning things, and by unlearning I mean really blowing up this, you know, the operating systems that we have, and tearing them down and installing new systems, new ways of thinking, new, you know, like even the way that we perceive knowledge or how we have come about to know something also needs to be decolonized. So I think it's really about taking things apart and not putting them together in new ways, but taking in the thing, like looking back to look to the future, all these different aspects. And I think it's not only for the colonizer to do that. We also, as women of color, for example, really also need to unlearn a lot of things, because we are in it, we are in the middle of it. And before we can, and I'm sure Qivioq, you will talk about this, but before we can even go to indigenization, we have to unlearn, you know, we have to figure out these wrong ideas or these really skewed ways of looking at us and the potential as humans as that we have. It also needs to be taken apart and, you know, installed in a new way so we can look at ourselves differently. Yeah, so just one more thing. Sorry, I'm talking. Put on the Oscar music, right, Eva?
It's still okay.
No, but I also think to just connect it with feminism, that we have this idea that feminism is about gender in this really binary way, but feminism for me is about justice, you know, and that's not only about gender, it's about intersections and all these different like unjust systems. And yeah, so to Chisom, over to you.
Thank you both for sharing. Your last point as well resonates so much for me, Thandi. I think of decolonization as interrogating the current systems and structures that we exist in, to ask why. because there are a lot of norms that we've passively accepted. Like, this is how things have always been done. According to whom? You know, like who? And I think it's quite important to interrogate things from that systemic nature, you know, because sometimes there's this idea, if it's not broken, why fix it? It's not broken for whom? And for whom is it potentially broken for? Right? So it's interrogating these systems in a way that holds ourselves also accountable to, as Thandi was saying, it's not just looking at the systems and structures that have come from colonialism and the leftover in coloniality, but also how we uphold those systems and structures in the way we engage with the world and also with ourselves. And then in tying it into feminism and gender equality, you know, I guess the one thing I want to add here is my process of current unraveling, where I've always identified myself as an intersectional feminist. And then in recent months, I don't even know if I get to identify myself as an intersectional feminist, because I feel like my entire existence is because of intersectional feminism. It's like me saying I identify as Black. Well, hello, look at me, right? So I think it's how I'm unraveling. I think it's almost a privilege sometimes to say I'm a feminist. It's like that is just who I am, my existence, my ability to take space in the world, to sometimes shake everything in order to just get a foot in. So it's something I'm also trying to process in terms of, yes, in March, we've all talked about gender equality and women this and women that, but oftentimes we need to ask, which women are we talking about? And I can tell you right now, we're talking about white women. For damn sure, we're not talking about women who look like me or Thandi or Qivioq. So we need to interrogate that. Eva, that's my rant. I'm done.
Thank you, Chisom. Okay, Qivioq. So, in our planning session, you shared a powerful viewpoint that we cannot fully decolonize systems with deep colonial roots, and that we should instead focus on indigenization. I had to practice this word, indigenization. What does indigenization entail? Could you share examples that effectively demonstrate that in practice?
Yes, thank you. Before I go on that, I wanted to go back to what Chisom said, because also the first time we met, I didn't introduce myself as a feminist. I introduced myself as an Indigenous woman, because in my head, it just inherently means that I'm a feminist, or not even a feminist, that it means that I inherently believe that we're all equal, be it nature, humans, or animals, and that we should treat everyone with respect. And that is something that apparently isn't part of the paradigm in the Western world. And that's why they needed to invent feminism, to be able to say, we do not agree with this patriarchy, we do not agree with that. In most indigenous peoples, because we're not a monolith, most indigenous peoples had a basis in respect in the societies that they had. And because of that, it's very difficult for me sometimes to remember whether or not I should address myself as a feminist, because it's such a new thing to add to something that I already believed I was doing. Yeah, and then when it comes to indigenization, I often come to the point that many things are simply too colonial in the aspect of being, or in the way that they're practiced. For example, university and academia, it's all about collecting knowledge for the few people who are privileged enough to do it. But you don't often give back. It's something that is changing within academia now. People are starting to give back and to give respect to the indigenous people and the indigenous knowledge that they're taking from. But it's still very much one of the last reaches of colonialism we see when we look at academia. So what have been important to me is, for example, when I taught, was to be able to teach in our language, in Galashisut, and to also ensure space for people who speak different dialects or even different languages here in Greenland. We have officially only one language here in Kalaallit, even though we have two other peoples here in Greenland, but the Danish government only recognized Greenlandic people as one monolith of indigenous peoples, which is actually against the International Convention on Indigenous People. So we have, in order to kind of combat that or work against the system, we have an example that I really love in our middle municipal area in Greenland, where people have actually changed the way that people go to school. The seasons have been changed. Instead of following the colonial or the Danish ways of when you have your holiday, your Easter holiday, your stuff like that, they have changed it to go with our hunting seasons and our harvesting seasons, and when it makes sense, so that parents and children no longer have to choose between doing what is traditional, what we have always done in our different areas, versus having to go to school to be able to survive in this modern world where you need a certificate to say that you're smart, right? So we have new ways of working around, but we shouldn't have to work around it. We can just have a better basis. So that's what I hope we will be able to achieve. But not only that, it's also the way that, for example, the UN is being done. It is for the nation states, by the nation states, and there's no space for indigenous people or any minorities who have not gained the prestigious honor of being a nation state in the eyes of the other nation states. So it is very much a system that do not make sense and do not actually help a lot of people, because we see the resolution being made by the UN, they're not being followed through. And we see the frustrations amongst the different populations all over the world, realizing that maybe the UN doesn't work. So those are some examples that are both local here, but also global.
Thank you, Qivioq. Thandi, through your articles and the Nordic Denial podcast with Chisom, you examined the role of Nordic denial in upholding white feminism. Could you unpack for us what Nordic denial is and how it perpetuates the exclusion of women of color from narratives of gender equality?
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Qivioq, also for, I think it's really interesting what you say about how conventions and stuff doesn't, because indigenous people are not a nation state per se with borders and how that kind of declines how we can protect people and their human rights, basically. Anyway, thank you for pointing that out. So I've really been interested in this dominant cultures, and of course also growing up as a person of color here in Copenhagen. So what this dominant culture kind of means for us as humans here in the Nordics. And I feel we have a very particular construct of that. And that's our dominant culture of consensus culture, or Nordic denial, whichever you prefer. And I've been investigating this term for a while and really being curious about it. What is it? What are the mechanics that are happening? And also with you, Chisom, and thank you for creating that space with me. And also how kind of it trickles in society and in our organizations. And it really came from a conversation I had with a colleague, and he had such great fascination with the Nordic countries. You know, our standards of living and the amount of trust and welfare systems, levels of education, all these different things. Nordic inventions, the food, and it had sprung from kind of him reading, of course, being in the Nordics, but also him reading this book about the Nordic secret, how, you know, that explains why the Nordics work so well. And it comes from this history of really smart, good people being enlightened from, you know, the age of enlightenment, and always neutral in conflicts and great at these different innovations, design, and also the Nordic wave phenomenon that kind of gained real interest around Western nations in the 2000s. And I told him that I feel it really stems from this strong culture of outer and inner self-image that is practiced in many spheres of Nordic life or whatever. And that is that the Nordics is more than a geographical region made of a few countries. It's like an ideal. It's a progressive project. And we are in denial with where we aren't so progressive, and that also plays a major role in upholding that ideal. So we float on that idea that we are champions of anything good in the world, human rights, and being the happiest nations in the world and all that stuff. And that image is really incompatible with inequality and discrimination. So that's why it's so well functioning here. I think it has really high levels of function. Because we don't have racism, we are neutral and good, and it doesn't apply to that Nordic construct of how we see ourselves, how we perceive ourselves. So we also deny that all inequality is not created equal, that this intersectional approach that we are all talking about here, kind of that way that it shows up and who has access to what, it also trickles into the different aspects of gender equality and what we can even discuss, the experiences with the discrimination are not being heard, or equality is not for everyone. And I think it's about, like I also write in that article, that, that ultimately the world has this default of anything being designed or being for the male body or the man or that's the default human. But in gender equality, we also have that default, and that's, like you said, Chisom, earlier, it's the white woman. And we are invisible in everyday lives, in our needs, like women of color, indigenous women, we are invisible, and our issues or our access to things are not being addressed at all. And every time we see these wins in so-called gender equality, it's always for white women, and there's no space for even debating why this is not feminism, and I think it's at the very core of this white feminism that we see in the Nordics very, very heavily, so I think it's about kind of acknowledging that this is happening, and can we get better at pointing out when it's happening, by having this space that we have now, but also, like I do, I write articles, we have the podcast, that we really need to start thinking about looking at our access as women from this intersectional viewpoint.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thandi. So Chisom, so in this journey towards decolonizing feminism, we also need to confront the role of Eurocentric feminism in upholding colonial structures and ideologies, even today. So, in what ways is this feminism that is practiced today in many spaces complicit with coloniality? And what concrete steps can be taken to confront and make amends for the silence of complicity in colonial violence and exclusion, specifically in the erasure and marginalization of non-Western women and communities? I know it's a mouthful. I can say it again if you need.
No, I think I get the gist. I think that could easily be somebody's dissertation, just trying to unpack and learn. But before I start, Thandi, I think it'd be quite a good resource if you can maybe share the link to that article. I think everyone needs to read it. So if you can share the link in the chat, that would be great. To your question, I think maybe it's important to separate or differentiate between colonialism and coloniality, right? Because what this means is that the end of colonialism did not mean the end of coloniality. So coloniality, essentially, we think of as the attitudes, values, the power structures that are upheld, usually in the West, in a way that continues to perpetuate Western dominance and colonial culture, right? And I think the second part of that question, Eva, was what can be done to bridge the erasure of non-white women within the discourse on feminism and gender equality, right? Something like that. I think the first route to solving a problem is acknowledging that that problem exists. You know, I think, you know, say for example, with Thandi's article, you know, it's acknowledging that this exists. Denial does not take us anywhere. And then being willing to engage, because it's not always comfortable or convenient to hear that, oh, okay, how I practice something upholds a system. It doesn't mean that white women are responsible for things that are wrong in the world, but it's important to reflect on where do I have privilege and power, and how can I better utilize it to, for lack of a better word, level the playing field, to recognize that not all women, all people are the same. I can recognize the vast amounts of privilege that I have. I think each and every one of us has privilege, for sure. It's fluid. So recognizing where we have them and in the rooms where we don't have them is a really good place to start as well, to engage and reflect and introspect. I think then, of course, policies go a long way, and this also has to come from a systemic perspective. Like, we need policies that we can implement, because sometimes, unfortunately, we need to be forced to create change. And I think something else that is coming up for me is oftentimes when we talk about challenges that women face or people face, well, since we're talking about women, we only tend to center from the West perspectives and experiences of white women. And it's important that we center the experiences of white women, and it's also important that we center the experiences of Black women and brown women and Indigenous women and Muslim women and queer women. And, you know, it's that intersection that Thandi is talking about, because we are not just women. It would be, I think the world would be this wonderful Xanadu if we all just experience discrimination on the basis of our gender. But those experiences intersect with all the other identities that we carry. And it is not fair or a practice of equality or equity to almost demand that people forget everything else that they are, that have shaped their experiences of the world, and just think of themselves as women, because the experiences are not the same. And I think in acknowledging those challenges and then being focused on how can we solve them, and solving these challenges also requires that we defer to the people who are experiencing said challenges, that we share power in recognizing that as much as I care about Indigenous, you know, challenges, that I am not the best suited person to come up with that solution, that somebody, in this case, like Qivioq, is who I defer to, because Qivioq has lived experience. So yeah, some ideas.
Whew, thank you, Chisom. That is really important to keep in mind. So, Qivioq, we're going back to you. Just a second, something's going on with my computer. I'm so sorry for this delay.
Maybe I can just comment on Chisom's, because I think this power sharing is not, it's not so simple, is it? I mean, we even had an episode of Nordic Denial where we were like completely mind blown that not all things are for me, you know, even though that I am a marginalized woman in some shapes and forms, we really need to think actively, all of us, when do we share power with others and when is this task or job not for me? Because we don't know it, like you said, we don't know everything, right? But we have this idea, and I think it's also part of a colonial system that we live in, or oppressive system that we live in, that we want to take as much as we can. We want to showcase the world that we know so much about everything, but we really don't. And once we power share, that makes everything so much easier to make decisions, or make informed decisions, but also allowing these voices to come to platform to fill the gaps of our knowledge. It's essential. So maybe you sorted it now, Eva.
Yes, I did. Thank you, Thandi. And thank you for the addition. It was worth it losing the document. Okay, so Qivioq. We often talk about dismantling oppressive systems and structures. In your opinion, is such a dismantling truly achievable? And what might be the process of dismantling systemic barriers within feminism in the Nordics? And what might the process of dismantling systemic barriers within feminism in the Nordics look like? How would it look like?
I think for me, I don't really think only in the Nordics, especially because I live in the Arctic, and the people I tend to feel the closest to are my fellow Inuit in Alaska and Canada, and Inuit Nunangat. So I think I will answer based on that Arctic, including the Nordics. For us, it's very much also something we have to consider is that there's very little understanding of the oppressed, of the indigenous people or the marginalized people in the Nordics and in the Arctic. All the history books, everything has been written for the nation states, for the nation building purposes that they needed it to be. And because of that, the way that our oppression was described was very clean off. And even sometimes it has managed to convince some indigenous people that they're not indigenous people, they're part of modernity, they're modern people, they do not have indigenous roots. So it's a way of truly indoctrinating people to let go of their identity as well. So education is extremely important. And the lack of education about ourselves, and also the lack of education in Denmark, for example, about Greenland, is crucial in the way that we are being treated by the Danes. They know so little about us that they treat us as if we're less than human beings sometimes. And it's such an ingrained part of them that they don't realize they're doing it until we point it out to them. And then they're mortified. And of course, they want to change their ways. And oftentimes they do, but that's on a personal level. It's not nationwide. And it should not be my job to do it every single time. It should be just the basic education that the Danes get should be about how they have oppressed and continue to some extent to oppress some people. And that is just Greenland and Denmark. We have a lot of other really big constructs, social constructs we need to let go of, because as Thandi said, this is not just about women, it's about people. And when you look at indigenous peoples, when we are showcased to the world, indigenous women are unfortunately never invisible, because we are the easy damsel in distress that the UN need to gather money for so that they can save us. Especially white women want to save us indigenous women. And then when we point out, oh, well, if you want to help indigenous peoples, you should help us do something about our men, because they have the highest suicide rate in the world. Indigenous men as a whole, not just one group, but all indigenous men in general commit suicide, indigenous young men. Why? why is no one helping them? Why can't we do something about it? Because the root of the problem is usually colonialism, and we don't really want to discuss that, do we? Because then the nation states have to really look in the mirror and go like, all of my wealth comes from you. So it comes to the point of really important questions that do not want to be answered because maybe some power will be lost. And also because there is, as a general, people in general do not know anything about it, so they don't know how to change it. But it's the government that keep these structures alive. So we need to inform the people so they can choose the right government, so that they can keep doing what needs to be done in a proper way. Unfortunately, we tend to choose government representatives that have their own interests. But it's simply like, I think of also that we are here talking about some things that are usually just like education. How can we get the same wages as the white people that come to our territories and so forth? But in other areas such as Alaska and Canada, my sisters, my Inuit sisters, are missing or murdered, and we don't know where they are. And so it is a big contrast to when I talk about, oh, we don't have the same rights as Danish women, we are not equal. And then I look at the other side of the other ocean and see people I share blood with being treated extremely different, and who have to fight for lives rather than livelihoods. All are equally important, but there's very little being talked about when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women. I know that's just come out of shows, and now people will learn more about it. But it's really, again, it's something that you should be educated about, not through television shows, and even the big reveal about how Denmark systematically has put IUDs and other kinds of contraceptives in Inuit women in Greenland, not Danish, only Inuit women. It was done through a popular podcast show as well. So all this knowledge, important knowledge, is always being done through popular media and not through education, or not through the proper way it should be done. It just showcases that we really truly need to change how we view education as well, because knowledge is truly power, and power has been taken from us for so long, and we really are part of the system now. So that's also why I educate about this, and I want to do more about it, because we cannot keep saying that someone needs to do something. And that's another pet peeve of mine, when people simply say someone needs to do something, it should be the government. But we have the power as well, because now we have the knowledge, so we have to do something about it, because otherwise it will go to waste, and it will be the next generation who have to clean up, not only after our forebears, but also after us. So we have a saying amongst Indigenous people that we're simply borrowing the earth from our descendants. So we really need to keep it clean. We need to keep it better, or better it for our descendants, so that it's something we have to treasure more. And yeah, I really do need us to also look at nature because of that. We need to look after nature better, because we feel it faster than you here in the Arctic. Not only are we melting faster, but all the pollutants that the world have created has reached our oceans faster. So we have more, I think it was 3 times higher heavy metals in our foods, especially in the east coast of Greenland. It's extremely dangerous, and you have to choose between that or the imported food from Denmark or Iceland, which are usually very expensive and are usually also very bad for you. So we see a system of oppression also, where our food not only is being polluted faster, but also sometimes, or oftentimes, as Indigenous people, our food is being criminalized, that we should not kill those cute animals because we should be vegan. And it makes sense in a place where you have a lot of vegetation, but where we have developed our bodies as well to need more protein. So we cannot simply change it to chia seeds. We need meat. So I think a lot of the ways people are trying to personally save the world by becoming vegan or something is simply not an option for us. But I'm glad that many people in the West are doing it, because in the end, it will trickle down to us as well, that people are changing. But we also have to remember, it's not the people, it's the corporations that we need to look at. And it's so many complex layers that in the end for us come down to, we need to treat each other better, be it Mother Earth or be it each other. So it's like, it sounds so simple, but in reality, because of the systems of oppression and systems of capitalism that has been created throughout the last couple hundred years, it's very difficult to dismantle them.
I think like this, just thank you first, Qivioq, for sharing. You know, I feel like every time I talk to you, there's so much education. I should pay you. And I think when you're sharing and bringing in this perspective, I think goes to kind of what, you know, Thandi, myself, you have said here about, it's not just about being a woman, you know, like so many other intersections are affected, down to our climate, down to our sustainability. And, you know, there are a lot of stories we don't get to hear about the people who you know, harmed, murdered, you know, and no sense of justice. And it's chilling to me to just sit here and hear this, and terrifying as well. So I just want to say thanks for sharing. It's just, yeah, thank you for sharing.
I think I also just want to comment.
Mm-hmm.
From me as well. Growing up in Denmark, you heard a lot of stories about Greenland, but it was always in a, you know, in a negative space. And I had this dream of taking my boys and visiting you up north, just to experience all the stories and narratives that we don't learn about. But then I was thinking about this, you know, when you talked about food systems and whaling and all these different things, that the way that we look at it here, down here, it's in a very kind of, we see it as inhumane. Even the way with the dog sledding and stuff, it's like inhumane because dogs are so cute and they can't possibly be working, you know, whatever. And with the slaughtering of whales, for example, which is super normal and is not in a crazy amount like you would see, for example, with the swine industry, where 40 million pigs gets killed each year in this country. I'm sure that, you know, it's just it's the level of ignorance or the level of misinformation, even, I would say, or non-information that makes us believe those things. So thank you for, like Chisom also said, thank you for the education. It's really, really needed.
Thank you also for me, Qivioq. I guess you really touched the nerve. Thank you so much for sharing. And I invite our audience, please put some comments in the chat. I know from the beginning you wanted to stay mysterious, but please share with us your thoughts. Like, we really want to know, you know, your questions, what's on your mind. So I encourage you. You don't have to, but I encourage you. We really want to know. Okay, so next question goes to Thandi. So before colonization, many societies had more fluid gender roles and equitable gender relations. How did the colonial influences contributed to this establishment and reinforcement of rigid gender roles across various cultures and including Nordic societies? And what strategies can be implemented to unlearn these deep-rooted ideas about gender roles, and how can we move towards like true gender equity and equality?
Thank you, Eva, for this question. It's tricky, but it's so important, and I think I'm still navigating, because where do you find knowledge that has been erased, or with all the pre-colonial kind of non-written items of how society is about, or what gender roles that might have been before, it's not easy to come by. So I think it's important to have these bases where we can also kind of, get a little bit out of each of our brains of what we know about these topics, right? But like I said in the beginning, that we need to look to the past to see a future. And I think you also just talked about that, Qivioq, about history books starts with these really one-sided narrative, and that's what we're taught. That's the basis of our history. And for example, being South African or being anywhere from the African continent, all history starts with in 1600 when somebody arrived here, and there's not there's not a lot of knowledge even in indigenous people, like what happened before that, because there was so much effort brought into completely erasing everything from language to culture to buildings to indigenous names and languages, and really kind of eliminating all sorts of evidence that there was civilizations before colonialism. And that's just something that I think is really important to say out loud, because sometimes we forget that there was something before Europeans came around the world looking for smarter people than themselves, like, of course there was that, and I think controlling that narrative with these negative connotations of gender roles, for example, in a hierarchy, like we also see today with, for example, Muslim women wearing hijab. I mean, it is insane how they are bashed because of them being women in a religious space or whatever. So I think really taking that in and understanding why this happened. I think it's also about, for example, in Denmark, I mean, the reason we burned women at the stake as witches was because the church needed to stay really powerful in collaboration with the Danish crown, for example. I think and it's not that long ago, it's like 200 years ago, I think the last witch was burned at the stake. And as far as I know, before that, women were not constructed in an inferior way to men, but the church and the crown had a real interest in making sure that society was like that, to hoard economic wealth and to kind of keep people in their places. So all of these colonial mindset, they were invented as a watchdog, as a way to control people and also control smart women with opinions, for example. And somehow I feel our biggest strategy to not being stuck in this binary way or this hierarchical way that we look at genders, because there's also a hierarchy, there's men, then there's women, and then there's all the other stuff, the non-binaries, the trans women, all the stuff, it's in a hierarchy, and we think about genders in a very hierarchical way, which is kind of present in this oppressive system. But I would say the strategy is really to get above it, is to, of course, learn our history and really ask questions, and especially ask questions to older people who still have knowledge from their, in between the generations. But it's about imagination. Can we imagine something to be different? Because I think when we look at gender roles, we look at it from the patriarchy, we look at it as a hierarchy, we look at it from competition, and if we see it, those men right now, I don't know if it's that way in Greenland or in Norway, but men right now in Denmark are saying equality went too far. It's just gone too far, which is it's so incredibly ignorant, or it's so, where does that even come from? But I think it's because their imagination of equality would be just patriarchy turned around, with them on the bottom of the food chain. but I don't see matriarchy in that way. I don't see matriarchy or feminist future in this hierarchy, in this competition. I see it as a circle, you know, I see it as a circle where together we have all these different perspectives that are equal to whatever we're trying to achieve there in the center, right? And I think this shift in platforms or platforming more opinions and reality will ultimately benefit us all. But I don't think we yet have the imagination to also get the allyship with men, because they think it's just a reverse discrimination, but it won't be. And I feel pretty confident with sitting with the four of you here that we would never just invert, put, with us on top, and then we would get to say what's right for everyone. I don't think we would do that. Yeah, so, but I think it's also about, like, imagine, like, looking also to the past. Like, for example, right now in some of the contexts that I'm part of, regeneration is a real, it's like the buzzword, or sustainability is a real buzzword. And I think sometimes we also need to look at the past to see that these words are not new. It's not something newly invented by Northern European organizations or startups or whoever is trying to solve for different things. It comes from, like Qivioq said, you don't need to maybe introduce yourself as feminist and Inuit, because those things are completely intertwined. And I think at the same way, like in South Africa, Ubuntu is it's like a life philosophy. It's not about hierarchies. It's about this circular movement between us and nature, and you and me, and I'm nothing without you, or I am because you are. And it's yeah. So yeah.
Something is coming up for me, Thandi, when you talk about Ubuntu, and also kind of when we talk about feminism, even for the people who have the privilege of identifying as feminists, is it's one thing to say the thing, it's another thing to be about it, and I think that's always quite often, at least in my experience, where there's that disconnect, is it's easy to say you are something, but then action it. And that's where it's crickets. You hear nothing, and there is a profound, and I don't know if there are cultural aspects to this, where as Nigerian, with formative years in the US, and now, like, been around the world, now in Norway, I don't understand how we can ignore what we know. Like, we can ignore fact. It's one thing where we don't know, we're unaware, we're ignorant. But then when we know better and somebody raises it, it's like there's so much to learn and there's so much to interrogate. And I think there's also just, it's a luxury to be able to disengage from learning. It's a luxury to be able to disengage from introspecting and being able to say, what is my responsibility here as Chisom? Right. And I think I'd really, if my one wish for everyone who is listening to this now on LinkedIn or later is interrogate, what is my responsibility? And how do I show up currently? Because it's easy to say we are feminists. It's easy to say we are against colonization, but we are upholding coloniality in every single way in which we engage and take space in the world. So, yeah.
No, definitely. Sorry, I'm just nodding in despair and frustration. It's like, I think what you're saying about that privilege is really, you are in a privileged position if you can just continue to do nothing. But the tricky part is that privilege is so hard to poke at because it feels uncomfortable. And I think in the Nordics and anywhere in the world where people have privilege, and it goes for my own privilege as well, when you poke at it, it feels unpleasant. And one thing that whiteness has taught the Western world is that we deserve not to be feeling unpleasant, So it's like a whole it's the structures, but it's also the feelings that we've been taught that we are allowed to have. That unpleasantness is just not in the books for me because I am on top of this food chain or whatever. So yeah, but it's true. It's easy to say stuff, but as I'm a parent, and I know that the most effective thing is to do things when I'm a role model for my kids. I mean, they just copy whatever. So saying stuff doesn't matter, doing stuff does. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's also perhaps an importance of being able to disconnect ourselves, our emotions, and our fragility from the problems and the systems in which we exist in. Right. So it's not necessarily that we're saying white women are the problem. White supremacy is the problem. That is a well-crafted system that has beneficiaries. So it's like, how do we separate? I think that's important because I think oftentimes, you know, where people hear like you say, oh, Thandi, you have privilege. Like, oh my gosh, what do you mean I have privilege? I've worked so hard for everything that I have in my life, right? And I think it's being able to separate ourselves from the privilege we enjoy within the systems and the structures that we exist in, and being able to acknowledge that, yes, I have privilege. It doesn't mean that I'm not worked hard. It doesn't mean that I'm not trying to be a good person, but it just means I have this privilege, right?
Oh yeah, it's a privilege when you can just disengage, and I can tell you from a position of a white woman, this system is so ingrained, and this privilege to us is so invisible that when we hear something like this, it sounds unreal. Unfortunately, and with all, like, for me, it was just like, what? It really took time for me to start seeing all of this. It's not that I didn't believe, it just sounded like, what do you mean? So I think these conversations are so important, and thank you all for sharing honestly. Okay. This next question is again for all three of you. So you can see how you wanna answer. The Nordics are often considered as utopias of gender equality. So nevertheless, how do you see gender equality in the Nordics today, and what does it mean to you? Okay, Chisom.
I was just about to say, like, kind of like what I often say about the Nordics. I need that branding person in my life. I need them for my business. Like, I need it. I think there are a lot of really great things about the Nordics. I think if you compare the Nordics as a region to other regions in the world, say, for example, North America, or even across, you know, say Europe, on paper, in many ways, and maybe also in practice in many ways, as you can see them reflect in the workplace, in leadership, in politics, they are doing better than a lot of countries or regions in the world, admittedly. So I can recognize that multiple things can coexist. In terms of gender equality, I think the Nordics are doing well, period. But then your question is, what does it mean to me? I can tell you that gender equality in the Nordics, in the way I experience it, was not designed for somebody like me. So it does exist for people. It's just difficult to reconcile that oftentimes it's only designed for a small perspective of what it is to talk about gender. And I also want to say something about gender. You know, I think maybe Qivioq and Thandi have raised it. it's really difficult to talk about gender equality without also bringing in perspectives from trans folk, non-binary folk, and gender diverse people, right? And so what does equality mean? Where even systematically, there are a group of people we don't even acknowledge their existence. So I think for me, it's also about unpacking that. But just like from a comparison perspective, are the Nordics doing significantly better than the US? Hell yeah. Than countries in Europe, than countries in Africa? Absolutely. From just that socioeconomic perspectives, but like interrogating who is it for? Who benefits, who doesn't? That's where work needs to happen.
Qivioq?
Yes, thank you. It's a question that touches the moment in Greenland as well, because in 1 week on Monday, Greenland will finally officially be able to have 2 women being the parents for 1 child legally. In Denmark, it has been possible for a little over a decade, but in Denmark and in Greenland, it's still not possible for 2 men to be fathers legally. So that's the next fight, because it's still easier for women because maybe we're being fetishized more, or we're seen as less dangerous than gay men. So gay men cannot be fathers in Denmark at the moment with the same rights as heterosexual couples. So we do see a lot of progress legally. But on the other hand, in Greenland, you cannot actually get hormones for treatments. You cannot be a trans person in Greenland because your hormones will not be available here. So one of our most famous trans persons, one of the people that actually started our own pride here in Greenland, had to move to Norway to be able to be their true self. And that just showcases how limiting legality can be, because it also reminds us just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's not a human rights violation. And that is something we see a lot in the Nordics, that they're actually really progressive legal-wise, but and I'm very grateful for that. What we do often see, though, is a racism that falls on women more often than men, I think. We see it all over the world with how people are trying to ban the hijab. So it's easier to see the woman as oppressed, again, because she doesn't look a certain way that they want it to. And the same for me when I am in Denmark. I pretend that I am Asian, because an Asian woman, even though she's often more fetishized than a white woman, at least in Denmark, is still treated as a human being. But as soon as Danish people hear that I am Greenlandic, they treat me less than human. And it's easy for me to be here as a public speaking person and be proud Inuk and talk about my rights. But when I'm in Denmark, even though Denmark is very little, Denmark becomes huge when you're by yourself and you're surrounded by people that you know. As soon as they find out you're an Inuk, you're less than human being, and they can treat you like literal shit. We have stories 10 years ago almost, where a man collapsed in the street in Denmark and people called to help him. And the person asked, how does he look? When they found out it was a person that looked Greenlandic, help didn't come and he died. And that is a very, very, very explicit way of saying we do not appreciate you as human beings. You are not seen as equal to us. And it was by a system. And now we hear more and more things about how we are oppressed. The IUD scandal that we are hearing about, which is a very, it's not enough, it's a contraceptive scandal. Women were giving contraceptives designed for animals, for horses or for dogs, and given to girls. Or they were forced to get IUDs. In the 70s and 60s, IUDs were huge. They're not the small things that they are nowadays. They were huge, and they basically took the virginity of down to 11-year-old girls. children because they didn't want them to get kids. And so it's a thing that we from the Human Rights Council and from the rest of Greenland really want to have investigated as to whether or not it's genocide or an attempt at genocide. So that was horrifying to learn. And then for me on my own body to realize when I was 13 and I started to get migraines as a 13-year-old girl, I went to the doctor and his very first suggestion was, you should get an IUD. So there's even though they don't have it enforced the same way anymore, there's still a habit amongst the doctors to give contraceptives to Inuit women. They don't do it the same way to non-Inuit women. Even children that were at boarding schools in Denmark were forced away from the Danes and were given IUDs. So it was very much on purpose. And we hear about these now. So we have a lot of anger and grief in Greenland at the moment about how we are treated, not even as human beings, but as animals. Animal contraceptives were used on us. So we really do need to have a better conversation between Denmark and Greenland in the future as well about this, because this is the tip of the iceberg. There's way more that we have yet to get to. And again, this is supposed to be a land that portrays itself as the good colonizer. They have a very famous saying where they say "iden beste mening." It was with the best thoughts in mind that they're doing what they did. So whenever there's something about, oh, they started having tuberculosis in Greenland during the 40s and 50s, oh, it was because we built them these luxuriously big Danish houses of wood in the Arctic, but we did it with the best purposes in mind. Like those kind of things are happening, and we see it in the system as well. It's a copy-paste system from Denmark to Greenland, and that also makes it obvious because we're so few, we're 56,000. We cannot have an administration that is 60% of the population if we want to match it perfectly with the Danish administration. So there's a lot of things we need to unveil and to do in order to reach a so-called utopia of equality in the Nordics, especially if you still want to consider Greenland part of the Nordics. Because again, we're so far away, we're in the Arctic, and we always say we're part of the Arctic, but we are always included in the Nordics when it comes to talk and it's global politics, then we're included in the Nordics. But as soon as it's about the betterment of Greenland, then you should just be grateful for the grant that you get from Denmark every year. How dare you be ungrateful? So there's a lot to unpack. I will put more space for others, but it's just, there's so much to unpack. It's very difficult to choose what I want to use as an example.
Thank you, Qivioq, so much. I just remembered, when you were talking in Croatia, we have a saying, I'm originally from Croatia, a way to hell was like made with good intentions, So thank you for sharing so much. Thandi.
Yeah, thank you, Qivioq. I think it's one thing I wrote down was like this the way that we talk about equality, like gender equality, it's so up here, it's like in Denmark, it's like, oh, the crop top movement, you'll see like young people going on the streets to be able to wear crop top in school, and I'm sometimes, and that's fine in its own whatever, right? But sometimes I really worry about the level of conversation that we have with equality, and justice when you tell your stories, and it's been all over the news, of course. It's not news to me, but I think the way we engage with it is so narrow and so superficial, and it's like it's not violence, but it really is. It's violence against women, and in that denial that we have in Denmark, and especially in the relationship with as colonizers. You know, it's being downplayed so much that I don't see it as a surprise that Denmark also is moving away from other Nordic countries in terms of equality. And it really, it worries me, you know, it worries me big time. It's not, we used to be up there with Norway and Sweden and Iceland and whatever within gender equality, but now we are way down the list, or this gender gap report that comes out every year. But we keep having this idea that we, like I said, also in this Nordic denial perspective, that we keep having a perception of the PR manager who tells our story so well, that we are so good at this and we don't need any help with anything, you know, and stories that comes about, for example, in this space of colonization and what have been done, for example, to women in Greenland and continues to be done. It's really hectic. I don't know how to explain it. Like when you were just sitting here talking, I was like, the conversations that we have about gender equality it feels like unreal. It doesn't go to the depth of what it really means, that are women who are being killed, or who, you know, is taking the rights without knowing to have children, or whatever it is. It's human rights violations, like, and I think sometimes putting, especially Denmark, together with that thought, it's mind-blowing. It's impossible to even believe it, you know? And that's why we never talk about it in a real way. I mean, the story about these women who are now filing a case against the Danish state, it was like a little like a little, notice in the newspaper, basically, right? So I think what I feel about the state of gender equality, especially here in Denmark, but also in the Nordic and in the Arctic per se, it's really like keeping our eyes on what's important, you know? Who are the most marginalized, and how do we lift them up first? And how do we work in these collectives to make that happen? And I feel it's also part of this, and I was just glimpsing at the chat at some point, somebody had asked, like, when people come together working in these intersectional ways, I think we have been taught not to do that. So it's very hard to actually come together and align on the topic of violence against women, for example. So that's something that we need to keep working on. And it seems so trivial or simple, but I think that's what we need to do. You know, how do we come together in these collective alliances that we can keep our eye on the prize? You know, it's not about putting, having some event on March 8th. It's about it's like lives, real lives out there. Yeah, so that's how I feel about it. A little bit scared, but hopeful to be with you to talk about it, but definitely scared.
Mm-hmm. Just reflecting on, because I've been in a lot of spaces this month where we're talking about women and gender equality, and just in some of those spaces just feeling like, really, is this where we're starting the conversation? Is this where we're at? And then hearing, engaging with the two of you here and just reflecting on the depths and how interconnected and convoluted the whole thing is, so I appreciate that sometimes it's even overwhelming to begin, to engage, but perhaps it's also more overwhelming, at least for me, it's more overwhelming just to ignore it. Yeah, so I'm just really thankful for this conversation, because that's the work to be done. Yeah, we can't have conversations up here about gender equality. If we really want to make a change, then we need to focus on what are root causes and how can we engage with root causes rather than symptoms. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all for this. Yeah, Thandi, and just this is echoing in my head, like, and keep in mind, these are all real people. And this is so important to have it always in our minds. Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for the comments that we're getting. We have about 10 minutes of conversation of just four of us, and then we're gonna go to questions. So please share your questions, share your comments. We really want to hear from you. Now, since we have 10 minutes, I'm going to ask Qivioq, in what ways do current gender equality initiatives in the Nordics fail to address the needs and rights of marginalized communities, particularly those of indigenous peoples and immigrants? And how can these initiatives be reimagined through an indigenous feminist lens?
We have actually very little information, for example, about LGBTQ plus members among indigenous people. We have zero in Greenland. It is something I also mentioned in live television yesterday, and hoping that our government will do something about it. Because it is very, very difficult to help people if you do not know if there are any, and also what they need at all. Because as you just said, we have to look at it from an indigenous feminist lens, means that we also have to make space for their own indigenous culture and understanding of what it means to be part of the LGBTQ plus community. And many of our brethren in Turtle Island, for example, like to say that they're two-spirit because that is part of their indigenous culture. And we do not have two spirits in Greenland, but we do acknowledge it, and we make space for it when we mention it. So it's very complex because we are not a monolith as indigenous people. And we are also, when you look at the Nordics, it is Inuit and Sami from Sápmi that we have to make space for. And I know for a fact that they have really strong organization in Sápmi when it comes to LGBTQ+. They also have very strong organization when it comes to combating their government's mining and use of their land. And unfortunately, despite that, we follow along on what Norway does. We're very happy. Many Greenlandic people are happy that they're not part of Norway, since Norway seems so comfortable with continued human rights violations, even by their own high court. So we do know that green colonialism is very much alive. We see it with the windmills. We see it in the way that that people are extracting oil and water and other things in Alaska and Canada, despite the wishes of the indigenous peoples. And we see how it's almost done here in Greenland. We had a huge demonstration back then, and we overthrew our government and got a new one. So that's what we did in order to save our country from green colonialism. And what was interesting back then was that the Danish national television show, radio and television, the broadcasting system, whenever they interviewed Greenlandic people that were pro mining inside Greenland, there would be no subtitles, because it would kind of signal to the Danish person following that this is one of us. And when they were interviewing someone who was against mining inside Greenland, despite them speaking perfectly fluent Danish, there would be subtitles, kind of subtly indicating to the television watcher that this is not one of us. You should not be on their side. And this is something that Denmark tends to do when they interview Greenlandic people, when it's a really subtle way of indicating to people without realizing it that this is probably not someone that you should be able to understand. So we do know that it is an area that the EU is also interested in. They want our lithium and other thorium in Greenland as well. And it's also an Australian company that has now sued the Danish state because they want to keep mining in Greenland. So it is something we need to address. We need to strengthen the laws to ensure that that kind of human right violation should not take place, and that, for example, the Nordic states should not ignore what wrongdoings the other Nordic states are doing. They're really good at supporting themselves. I think Denmark is returning a favor that Norway did, because Norway once helped Denmark retain Greenland after when the UN wanted them to either give us up or to make us into a free nation after the Second World War. So there's a history here where Scandinavia helps each other do each other's, or hide each other's dirty work sometimes, perhaps. So it makes it very difficult to be hopeful, and because you need to be realistic, because power wants to retain power. But the more we are out in social media and in the media in general, and reminding the people who can vote about what the people they have voted on are doing, the more changes we see. And we also see a bigger interest in Greenland from Danish side. We famously had a visit from Ursula von der Leyen, and there it was not only her that came to visit, it was also Mette Frederiksen, the Danish state minister. And for many Greenlandic people, it looked like she was saying, no, this is our colony. So but as it is right now, we are part of the Danish kingdom, but the visuals of it, the way that the interaction happens, it reminded people that there's an inequality in the kingdom of Denmark. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Qivioq. Okay, so we have a few minutes, so I think we can wrap it up if you can all share best practices or top tips to not be a performative or surface level white feminist or gender equality activist. Who wants to start? Thandi, yes.
I think for me, it's about this data, like collect the right data, and don't be afraid of asking, women of color, for example, what they think and feel. Just because you're comfortable with the color of my skin doesn't mean I am. So I think collecting data would be a good idea. Like you also said, Qivioq, there's like these dark areas where we don't know how people are thriving in different intersections. So I think that's super important. But I also think, and Chisom, we've talked about this before, that in the Nordic languages, we don't really have a word for equity. And I think we have so much emphasis on equality that we forget equitable measures. And we can't have equal measures. It's a misconception, and I think we get so stuck on that. Equal measures is BS. We can't use it for anything because we all need different things to access whatever we need to access, right? And equity is the only pathway to justice. And yeah, and here comes my son. Stop. Yeah, so I think getting beyond the misconception that we need equal measures would be one thing to do.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Qivioq or Chisom? Chisom.
I can just quickly share to add to that. I completely agree with Thandi on the importance of having that equity lens. I think there should be an emphasis on intersectional gender mainstreaming. So representing different people, different identities, different backgrounds, different class. I think emphasis on economic empowerment is also important. Unfortunately, we still live in a capitalist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-this, anti-that society. And within this capitalistic world that we engage in, shifting economic power is going to also be important. And I think, when I reflect on what Qivioq has shared about the trigger warning, the rate of suicide for Indigenous men, I think we also need to include men and boys into the conversation, right? And yeah, so I think that we need to have an intersectional lens to gender mainstreaming, and we need to include everyone, which to date we have excluded or erased. So yeah.
Thank you, Chisom. Oh, sorry, Qivioq.
I think it's also very much a lot of what we are protesting against tend to, in the end, be capitalism. And what we have seen is boycotts do work. So in order to not just say, oh, I don't like them, actually just completely boycott them. It's very difficult in the beginning, but you will in the end find some brands that are more sustainable, sometimes even indigenous or small businesses that you can help, that have your values as their core. And that is also important for me to highlight, because we are very reliant on imported goods here in Greenland. So we are very much aware of what it means to import certain things and to drink or eat certain things that are maybe promoting the genocide of some people. So it's something that we are also learning here. We are also learning to be better at helping others and to be better at protesting. We're very few, again, in 56,000 people here, but there was around 25 people that were protesting when Ursula von der Leyen came, protesting against the genocide in Palestine, and also about the politics that the EU are representing in that case. So we are not blind to what we can do as well, even though we are few. It could be part of the answer to one of the first questions maybe we had gotten about how what was it here? It says that if there was any successful examples of collaboration between feminist activists from different cultural contexts advancing gender equality and decolonization. And there I can say that the Inuit activists were actually the ones that helped found the global, the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples Issues. It was suggested by a Greenlandic woman, Henriette Rasmussen, and it was her and a lot of Danish people and people from all over the world that met and actually ensured that we got this Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples Issues that meets every year to address many of the problems that we find related to the economic and social development, culture and education and health and human rights of Indigenous peoples. So it's a very important entity that we were actually part of the what do you call it, the founding members, you could even call it. We are also from Greenland the founding members of the Arctic Council, even though on paper it says it's the nation states that are the signatories. The people that worked to achieve the Arctic Council that we know today were people from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Qivioq Council International, the Arctic Athabascan Council, and the Sami Council. So we have a lot of indigenous peoples that lobbied together, that worked together to reach a place where indigenous collaboration could take place. And when indigenous collaboration takes place, it is inherently feminist. So that's why I wanted to put it that way. So we have a lot of success stories that are still working to this day today, because the foundation was actually feminist, even though some of them are within the UN system. But for many of us, many hadn't realized that you cannot really dismantle a system with the master's tools. So there's a lot of that going on right now, and many people are still questioning whether or not the UN is actually a place for us, for indigenous peoples. But we need to be heard. We need to be able to communicate with the nation states. So that's why I wanted to showcase that Permanent Forum do work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Qivioq. Okay, thank you all. This is not the end, don't worry. We've just came to the end of our first section of hour and a half, where I ask questions to our speakers, but now we're going to move to your questions. And thank you so much. The questions were great and very interesting, and I really hope that we can get to all of them. Usually it happens that sometimes we can't, so I want to apologize in advance, but these questions will be taken into account. Okay, so the first question we received is from Shantani, and she asks, given the privilege it takes to overlook skin color or visible diversity, how can we actively combat both misogyny and misogynoir within feminist spaces? Who would like to answer? This was a question for all, maybe.
So I'm not sure I have a clear answer for that, but one thing that like we also talked about earlier, one thing that we can say so many things that we are, you know, I'm feminist or I'm whatever, but I think if we constantly stay curious and ask questions, you know, to ourselves when we do something, have I taken into account X, Y, and Z? So I think it's about being more introspective with our own biases and how we show up in the world by staying, you know, kind of inquisiting ourselves with questions. Have I taken this into account when I do X, Y, and Z? I would say that would be a first step to not only in this feminist space or in gender equality, but in any space, actually.
Just to add that, just to describe or define, in case, I guess we tend to assume that everyone knows this, but I see someone has asked us about the difference between intersectionality and decolonization. So I also wanted to just quickly talk about the difference between misogyny and misogynoir. Misogyny is, of course, discrimination towards women, and misogynoir is discrimination towards Black women, especially, and women of color. I think that it's interesting to reflect on spaces or situations in which our bias shows up in the world. So it's in reflecting on, say, for example, you're in a room, let's say with other women, and you find yourself treating one differently or another differently. And maybe you have to ask yourself, like, why am I behaving like this? Is it about them or is it about me? Right? Because if you're in a space, for example, with a person with disability and you see that you're treating them differently from somebody who's not disabled, or you're treating a trans woman differently than you're treating a cisgendered woman, what does that mean? Why am I having this reaction? So I think it's quite easy to externalize our feelings and our responsibility for our feelings, as opposed to internalize and take responsibility for how we engage with others or how we respond in different spaces. So I think it's important to, so the question about there's a privilege in overlooking color, like I don't see you color, you know, curious. Oh, sorry, I don't see color curious. I think seeing color doesn't mean that you see like, oh yeah, Chisom is a Black girl, or, you know, Qivioq is indigenous, or this or that. You know, that is not what we're saying. It's saying when you refuse to see the intersections that we carry, the identities that we hold, you think that everyone is exactly the same. And then whatever is norm for you becomes norm for everybody else, because that is how you perceive it. And what Thandi spoke about, equity does not exist, because you're like, yeah, Eva and I are the same, Qivioq and I are the same, Thandi and I are the same. And the reality, as much as we have similarities, there are things that make us very different in how we exist and experience spaces in society. So I think in order to combat misogyny, we also need to recognize that there are some women who also practice misogyny, right? It's not exclusive to only people who are not women. There's a funny stat, I call it funny because it's funny, where you see that men are more likely to hire men and women are more likely to hire men. So a lot of this misogyny or behaviors is also integrated in our psyche, in the way we've existed in society. So I think it's quite important to interrogate, how am I feeling towards this woman? How am I feeling towards this indigenous person? Will I talk to a Black woman like that? Would I talk to a white woman like that? I think interrogating where we stand and how we behave and taking responsibility for our behavior, like, oh, Thandi did not trigger me. I am triggered by Thandi. Language goes a long way as well in taking responsibility.
Thank you, Chisom. Okay. Can we go to the next one? So the next question is from LinkedIn, from our viewers at LinkedIn. Are there examples, and it's also for all of you, are there examples of successful collaborations between feminist activists from different cultural contexts in advancing gender equality and decolonization? What do you think was key for them to work out?
I also think Qivioq already kind of answered this as well. And yeah, so just stating. Yeah. But I don't know if you had more to add.
Yeah, I can just say I didn't answer the last part. What do you think was key for them to work out? And I think it's pretty much mutual respect and understanding of each other's humanity.
Again, we're all real people. Okay, so next question is from Susan. What's the difference between intersectionality and decolonization? And she says it's a question for Thandi and Chisom with a question mark. So maybe because you two talked about it, maybe it's for you, but I think it can be for all, definitely.
I think, Chisom, you explained pretty well about intersections and what it means just before. That it's the identities that we carry and how it makes us perceive and have access to different things in, in society overall. While decolonizing, for me, like we spoke about in the beginning, is very much more like a mental frame that we need to choose, that can we intentionally look at society and the different realities that we are part of, relationships that we are part of, from a new lens, or can we install new operating systems within ourselves to really come out of the ideas that are like our norms, all the things that we find is normal? Can we install new ways to look at society, organizations, gender roles, all these different things? So it's more like I feel like decolonization is very active. It's an active kind of way of, being critical about the norms and the denials that we carry. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
Yes, thanks for sharing, Tanya. I just wanted to give credit to the mother of intersectionality. It is an analytical framework that was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to understand how, at the time, Black women experienced the world. And now I think it has been expanded to look at how people experience the world at an intersection of their social and political identities. So basically just saying that we are not one thing So we're not just women or people, that we experience the world at that intersection of all the identities that we carry. So yeah, just wanted to add that, Leah.
Yeah, and I wanted to come with the last thing. Decolonization is very much also holistic. It looks at everything. So it is also intersectional, but it also includes like spirituality and many things that are often considered too fluffy for Western knowledge systems. So it very much pertains also to be able to be free of the oppression that many colonized nations are still under to this day. As Chisom said before, we are still living in colonial times. And so even though colonization is supposed to be over, the colonial ways that are being used are still here. We see it very, very strongly here in Greenland that the systems of oppression are very much still alive. And we're supposed to be some of the most progressive indigenous peoples in the world that have reached the most because of our act of self-government. Despite all of that, we are still very much in under coloniality. So there's many ways that you can use both terms, but when it comes to decolonization, it is often because indigenous peoples are speaking on behalf of their people or their communities in order to gain independence or simply to not be colonized anymore. So that's why we have those two terms that we use differently here now.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Okay, another question from LinkedIn for Qivioq. How do you perceive that white feminism has reacted to decolonization in recent years? Do you see a general effort to reflect and decolonize?
Both yes and no. I have also seen how a lot of different scholars are using it as a trend to have to use the word decolonize in their work in order to gain funding. So sometimes they just randomly add in the word and say that they're working together with an indigenous scholar, when in actuality, maybe they just wrote an email to them. So we have a lot of frustration with many Western scholars who the last 10 years have really tried to ride that wave without actually helping and without actually being feminist and without actually doing any work that can in any way enhance or help the people that they're writing about. So there is that, but on the other hand, we also see a lot of people gaining more and more knowledge about Greenland, for example, and other indigenous peoples. TikTok and young activists on TikTok and Instagram have been phenomenal at reaching out and teaching people about what we are going through and what we have been going through, and that coloniality is still present in our everyday life. So that has really helped the way that we are perceived as well. And the scholars that do reach out are also now people that truly want to cooperate, that truly wants to help and lift up this. And of course, we're still a little bit apprehensive because we have a lot of history of white saviorism, and it's difficult to always having to be wary of the people who want to collaborate or who wants to help, because it's a fine line sometimes, and we do get a lot of inquiries here in the University of Greenland, for example, from researchers across the world. So it has been really nice to be able to get funding and to be able to work on something that is so important. But it has also increased the inquiries from people who do not actually care, but who simply want to get some funding.
So yeah, both sides. Okay, another question for all. Why do you think some cis women believe there is no space for trans women in feminism? Do you think transphobia is connected to colonization somehow?
In Greenland, yes.
What isn't connected to
Yes,
colonialism?
I was like, that's a very clear yes.
I think that's a
It-
clear yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Like I think I spoke about earlier that sometimes the systems that we install to uphold another system is like hate or transphobia, all the phobias that wasn't existing as far as my knowledge before colonialism. So I think it's very intertwined. And I think maybe the first part of the question is that maybe they don't see trans women as women, which is why they don't feel it has a place in the feminist in feminism or whatever. But again, like I also said earlier, that we also need to try and unlearn what feminism is about and gender equality, like that it's more than just a binary of men and women. It's so much more.
Mm.
Yeah, in Greenland, colonization is basically put together with Christianization.
Mm.
And Christendom really is all about oppressing people so that you can use them for something. It's very, very close to what we nowadays simply view as capitalism. So for our point of view, Greenland is extremely Christian now. A lot of us are Christian on paper, if not in real life. And because of that, there is a lot of homophobia and transphobia and a fear, if not a hate of people who are different. So it's very much still present. But like I said, just before we started here, I was in television yesterday here talking about the new law that will take place from 1st of April. And I was so apprehensive of opening our inbox at the Human Rights Council after that. I had expected to get a lot of hate messages. But what we got instead was a lot of messages of love and thanks for creating more understanding about this issue and for opening up the dialogue. So I think what is often simply needed is this dialogue, to find a place where you can safely inspect something or talk about it. And suddenly it's not as dangerous or scary anymore. But that is what we are indoctrinated into thinking if we grow up with Christianity, that what is different from us is something that will lead us to hell. And so it's definitely a yes from me for that.
Thank you, Qivioq. Okay. I think we have time for another question. I know that Chisom mentioned a language and how important it is. And this is what this question is actually dealing with. It says, can you discuss the importance of language in decolonization of feminism, especially in terms of reclaiming and refining terms that have been historically loaded or exclusionary? They didn't say which terms they actually mean, but I'm sure there are plenty.
Something that is coming up for me, maybe it's not even related to feminism, so to say, is language and sometimes the need to concede language. So take the word woke. Woke has so many different negative attention to it that, oh my gosh, don't say woke. And for me, I think it's important to not concede language. You know, woke has a meaning. And if you engage with that meaning, it means to be alert to social inequities, for example. Why is that a word that we need to change? Because some people feel fragile with what that is, right? So I think also just down to, so if we think about it even from, say, like a decolonial, indigenizing perspective, there are cultures where their language was like quite well erased, right? Where reflecting on the words, like I found that when I first had my child, that I was looking for books, like African books, Igbo books, to read to her, and realizing that a lot of the books that I grew up reading, a lot of the songs that I grew up singing was not for me, was not created for me. And sometimes they were used to make fun of people like me and my ancestors. So it's really interesting to look back at words that have been taken and weaponized, and like, how can I take back my language? That's what's coming up for me. I'm going to hush because probably Thandi and Qivioq have something to add here.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying. Like, there are present day wordings that are being hijacked for an agenda, like a political agenda, right? But I also think it's so important to think about language in a historical sense. Like I said, colonialism also has worked really hard and put a lot of money, I guess, also into eliminating meanings and languages and proverbs and all these things that are culturally very relevant for different communities. And it's an exclusion thing. It's done to exclude us, right? It's done to not being connected to our histories and the meaning of different things, and that can be, where we come from, in what we know about our land, what we know about customs, and all these different things. But I think we can see it in multiple ways. There's both this historical sense of how language has been eliminated to exclude us from our own communities, but also, like you say, how, for example, a term like woke has so many negative connotations, even though it was just literally made up for, are we kind of attentive to racism and all these different things? So yeah, I do think it's very connected to exclusion, language. Yeah.
Language is extremely important in Greenland. We have had a debate about it for decades because language has very much also been used against us. That it lacks terminology, that we're not smart enough. We can only reach university level if we speak fluent Danish. I speak 4 languages fluently because I have to, not because I want to. And it just showcases that it creates you cannot speak your mother tongue in Greenland in order to become someone in your own language, in your own country. So that's one of the things we mean when we say land back. We want our land back. We want everything that entails that. Also includes language. It also includes our tattoos in our bodies. Our regalia should be ours. What we have done that isn't actually a reclaiming, but rather banning a word. 2 years ago, there was a huge debate in Denmark and Greenland that we want Danish companies and Denmark in general to stop using the word Eskimo, because we are not Eskimos and it's a derogative language. We did not want to be called that. So we demanded that they remove it. Some companies still use it, but they have been boycotted, a lot of them. Again, it's the capitalist language that works here. If you're boycotted, if you do not get money, then you stop doing it. So there's a lot. It's a really good question because there's so much significance in language when you want to decolonize. We are so lucky in Greenland that we can speak our language, that the majority of us speak our language fluently, while our brethren in Alaska and Canada have a very opposite problem. They still have a lot of the regalia, they still have a lot of the cultural dances, but cannot speak their language to the same level anymore. While we have lost our regalia and our tattoos. These are new. They are from 2017 because we couldn't have them for 300 years. So it's a really good question, and it just showcases also what languages can you speak at the UN? There's very few languages you can use. It's the major languages, it's the powerful languages. The rest of us, we have to learn English or Spanish or French or Arabic. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, it's 15:00. Yeah, I don't know if you speakers have anything to say in the end, but I definitely want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I've been touched and my heart, been sad and angry, but also hopeful. Thank you so much for your honesty. Thank you for this conversation. And I really hope we'll have more conversations like this. And I think I say that for every DNI in the workplace, that we need more conversations. So I'm sure that the next conversation is going to be as great as this. And thank you for all for joining. And thank you for your comments and questions. Yeah, this pre-Easter atmosphere is kind of with us, So yeah, that's me. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. I learned so much. Qivioq, Thandi, always just the honor to be in the same room, be it digital or in person with you, and just learning nonstop. I've taken so many notes, so much notes. Thank you. I needed this as well. After the morning I had, I needed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to thank the three of you for hosting and creating such a beautiful space. Like we need it more than we know. And I think we go into it as now we need to, like present something to people around us, but actually we also need to be here in this space. So thank you so much for that, for breaking my Easter break with this beauty.
Thanks, Eva, for a great moderation. Thank you.
It was also what I needed. Actually, I feel so much softer than when I came in. I was like, tell me where you're from. Yes, so thank you all. And have a great holidays and vacations. In Norway, it starts tomorrow, just so you know. You can be jealous.
Thank you all. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.